Hello there, friends. Today I have ridden my bike out to the beautiful riverfront park, and the azaleas are in full bloom today. Today I'm going to be reading to you an article from the Harvard Business Review series on empathy. Here's the book. This article, when I first read it, gave me a bit of pause for thought, and I hope it will do the same for you. It's thought-provoking because it's so against our typical intuition on how other people respond to our experiences when we are seeking empathy from them. The name of this article is "It's Harder to Empathize with People If You've Been in Their Shoes." The article is by Rachel Rutten, Mary Hunter McDonald, and Lauren Nordgren. It was, in fact, I'll tell you a little bit about the authors. So, Rachel Rutten is a doctoral student at the Kellogg School of Management. Mary Hunter McDonald is an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School. And Lauren Nordgren is an associate professor of management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management. Now, this article is adapted from content that was posted on the website, the HBR website, in October 2015. And so it's reasonable to assume that all three of them no longer hold any of those posts. So the article, because it's adapted from content, I'll give a quick synopsis. It basically states the claim that it is harder to empathize with people if you've been in their shoes. And it goes through 3 studies that these ladies conducted. And because it's adapted from content, it's been written in a sort of short form. So I may jump in periodically to clarify some of the studies that they've done. And then they go on to sort of clarify why they think that this is the case. So with no further ado, let me begin. Imagine that you have just become a new parent. Overwhelmed and exhausted, your performance at work is suffering. You desperately want to work from home part-time to devote more attention to your family. One of your supervisors has had children while climbing the corporate ladder, while the other hasn't. Which supervisor is more likely to embrace your request? Most people would recommend approaching the supervisor who has children, drawing on the intuition that shared experience breeds empathy. After all, she has been there, and thus would seem the best placed person to understand your situation. Our research suggests that this instinct is very often wrong. In a series of recent experiments, we found that people who have endured challenges in the past, like divorce or being skipped over for a promotion, were less likely to show compassion for someone facing the same struggle, compared with people with no experience in that particular situation. In the first experiment, we surveyed people participating in a polar plunge, a jump into a very icy Lake Michigan in March. Sorry, mosquitoes are out. All the participants read a story about a man named Pat who intended to complete the plunge but chickened out and withdrew from the event at the last minute. Critically, participants read this story either before they had completed the plunge themselves or 1 week after they had completed the plunge. And we found that polar plungers who had successfully completed the plunge were less compassionate and more contemptuous of Pat than were those who had not yet completed the plunge. So the people surveyed in this survey was split into two groups, one of whom had not yet completed the plunge, and they read a story about Pat, who chickened out at the last minute and withdrew. And generally, they state that these people who had not yet completed this plunge were more compassionate and they understood his situation. Whereas the people who 1 week after having completed the plunge themselves were asked to evaluate Pat's decision, they were less compassionate. They were more contemptuous, saying, "Oh, well, why didn't you? I was able to do it." And it's interesting that they were not more compassionate insofar as they probably experienced the same concern about jumping into a very cold lake. In another study, we looked at compassion towards an individual struggling with unemployment. More than 200 people read a story about a man who, despite his best efforts, is unable to find a job. Struggling to make ends meet, the man ultimately stooped to selling drugs in order to earn money. And we found that people who had overcome a period of unemployment in the past were less compassionate and more judgmental of the man than people who were currently employed or had never been involuntarily unemployed. And again, it is the people who have been through unemployment that were less compassionate to this person who, in the story, stooped to selling drugs. The people who had never been unemployed, they were much more compassionate to this person. They were much more understanding of his situation, despite the fact that they had never been in that situation themselves. A third study examined compassion towards a bullied teenager. The participants were told either that the teen has successfully been coping with the bullying, or that he failed to cope by lashing out violently. And compared with participants who had no experience with bullying, participants who reported having been bullied in the past themselves they were more compassionate towards the teen who was appropriately coping with the bullying experience. However, as in our earlier studies, participants who were bullied in the past were least compassionate towards the teen who failed to successfully cope with the bullying. So interestingly, they draw a distinction here. When they share the story of the teenager who was being bullied and was successfully able to negotiate that situation, they were more compassionate to that person. They were more compassionate to the person who was succeeding. But the person who had failed and who was lashing out and being violent, they were less compassionate, more judgmental, more contemptuous to the person who was struggling with the same thing that they had struggled with, but failing. Taken together, these results suggest that people who have endured a difficult experience are particularly likely to penalize those who struggle to cope with a similar ordeal. But why does this occur? We suggest that this phenomenon is rooted in two psychological truths. Firstly, people generally have difficulty accurately recalling just how difficult a past aversive experience was. Though we may remember that a past experience was painful, stressful, or emotionally trying, we tend to underestimate just how painful that experience felt in the moment. This phenomenon is called an empathy gap. Secondly, people who have previously overcome an aversive experience know that they were able to successfully overcome it, which makes them feel especially confident about their understanding of just how difficult the situation is. And the combined experience of, one, I can't recall how difficult it was, and two, I know that I got through it myself, creates the perception that the event can be readily conquered, reducing empathy towards others that are struggling with this event. This finding seems to counter our intuitions. When we asked participants to predict who would show the most compassion for the bullied teenager, for instance, a teacher who'd endured bullying himself, or one who never had, an overwhelming 99 out of the 112 people chose the teacher who had been bullied. 99 out of the 112 people asked expected that the teacher who had experienced bullying themselves would be more compassionate. And this means that many people, most of us, are instinctively seeking compassion from the very people who are least likely to provide it to us. And this clearly has implications for peer-to-peer office communication. And choose the person that you vent to carefully. And also mentorship programs, which often pair people from similar backgrounds, similar experiences, and that this needs to be re-examined. But there are also important lessons for leaders. When approached by employees in distress, leaders may believe that their own emotional reaction to the issue should guide their response. For example, an executive who broke the glass ceiling may focus on her own success when considering an employee's concerns about discrimination. Similarly, managers in overworked industries such as consulting and banking may respond to employees' concerns about burnout and fatigue with comments such as, "Well, I had to work those hours, why are you complaining?" And in fact, there is some evidence that this mechanism is at play when older workers push back on reforms designed to help cut down on overwork. Simply put, leaders need to get out of their own heads, to place less emphasis, not more, on their own past challenges. Less emphasis, not more, on their own past challenges. To bridge this empathy gap, leaders may be best served by focusing on how upset the other person seems to be, or by reminding themselves that many others struggle with the same challenge. Returning to the opening example, the supervisor approached by an exhausted new parent could instead think about the countless other new parents who struggle to find work-life balance, many of whom are ultimately pushed out of the workforce. When we're trying to encourage someone to be more empathetic, we often say something like, "Walk a mile in his shoes." As it turns out, that may be exactly the wrong thing to say people who have worn those shoes themselves.